I want to make sure that that I take good care of myself so that I can be full to give to other people as God asks me to on a daily basis. So that's kind of my lens that I come at boundaries from. So before we go too much further, I want to reference a couple of different resources. Pretty much everything, some of the things, the examples and things this morning are going to be from my own brain, but just a lot of the wisdom that we'll talk about this morning is going to be from these two resources. So the first one is just the book Boundaries by Henry Cloud and John Townsend. And the second one is by just this brilliant guy from Redding, California. He's a pastor out there, Danny Silk. He's kind of the relationship guru, more or less, out in at Bethel Church in Redding. And his book, Keep Your Love On, is just super full of just lots of really practical pieces for how to do healthy relationships, and a huge part of that is boundaries. So if you like anything you hear this morning, I would definitely encourage you to follow up with these two books because they are just really helpful, really powerful tools. Let's talk just a tiny bit about kind of where we're going. First of all, we'll talk about biblical foundations, because I think sometimes as Christians, it's really easy to think like, I'm just supposed to give myself completely away. Like, I'm not supposed to. Jesus didn't have boundaries. Jesus poured out his life for all the sins of humanity. And that is a falsehood. He did pour out his life for all the sins of humanity. But he had boundaries while he did it. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit. And yes, then we'll talk about what kinds of things are inside our boundaries, what things are we responsible for, because if we can define that, man, it makes it so much easier to define, okay, what's outside our boundaries? What is not my job to take care of? So now I want to be real clear. Jesus died for our sins. That's all very true. But I'm just saying he had boundaries while he did so. And we can too. Not that we're going to die for the sins of humanity. So what's inside our boundaries? What's outside our boundaries? Then I like alliteration. So blunders with boundaries. Just different faux pas that it's really easy to accidentally fall into in the name of boundaries. I'll do just a tiny bit more teaching about some practical pieces for, okay, what does it actually look like to set boundaries? Biblical foundations, boom, shaka. And you're probably wondering, what in the world does boom shaka mean? And I think I made it up. I don't know, maybe I heard it from somewhere. But it's kind of my version of amen. It's like amen, but it's maybe just a tiny bit more fun to say. So this morning, if there's any points that I make that you're like, oh yeah, that's just so good, just don't hesitate to be like, boom shaka, and just say that out loud. So maybe let's all practice together on the count of 3. So 1, 2, 3, boom shaka. That was pretty good. Okay, so without further ado, let's kind of jump into the biblical foundation stuff. So first of all, some reasons that we can kind of use Scripture sometimes to think, hey, we're not supposed to have boundaries. Scriptures like, deny yourself, take up your cross and follow me, love one another. I think we can, and those things are very important. I'm not denying their importance or their significance, but we can so focus on those things and think that we're to exclusively do those things. I'm to exclusively love other people and not think anything of myself. And that's not what the Bible says. The Bible says to love other people as you love yourself. So that means that at times it's important to give ourselves attention as well. Carrying each other's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. We'll talk more about that scripture in a moment, but we can look at that scripture and think, well, I'm just supposed to shoulder, stuff for other people all the time. That's my job. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. The scripture, whoever loses his life will find it. So when the Bible talks about that, it's talking about losing our lives to the lordship of Jesus, not losing our lives to the needs or even the naggings of other people. All of these things can kind of leave us thinking like, well, I'm just supposed to give myself away. I'm not supposed to have boundaries. And that is just not the case. Let's kind of go into some of the specific scriptures that just can create a different case for boundaries. Specifically, Genesis 1:28, God is kind of giving Adam his mandate for, hey, you're created, you're here, this is what I want for you to do. And his first mandate, maybe it's not his first, but one of his first mandates to him is like, I made this whole earth for you. I want you to subdue it. I want you to rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and all the things that are creeping on the ground. And that word rule, I want you to rule. That implies I want you to take ownership of. I want you to take responsibility for these things. And part of taking responsibility, part of taking ownership is learning what is what is in my boundaries? What am I supposed to take ownership of? What's mine and what's not mine to take ownership of. The problem, I think, sometimes in the church is we can kind of be like the birds from Finding Nemo, where we just think like everything is ours. Mine, 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 mine. And that's a recipe for resentment, because then we pour out and we pour out way more than we ever intended to give. And that's not what God asks of us. In Galatians 6, in verses 2 and 5, there's kind of a couple different commands. The first one is carry each other's burdens. The second one is each one should carry his own load. So it's kind of interesting if you look at the Greek words there for both of those. For the first one, carry each other's burdens. The Greek for burden there means excess burdens. So things that are just too big for one person to carry alone. And certainly those things happen sometimes. There's disasters and tragedies and just, different hardships that everybody goes through. And absolutely in those times, that's why we're a family. That's why we're a church. It's to come around each other and help carry those big excess burdens. But when it talks about each one should carry his own load, the Greek for load there means cargo or burden of daily toil. So just as far as like our daily needs, just our person, we are responsible for those things primarily. And let's go ahead and go on to the next slide. There's a quote from Cloud and Townsend that I just love, kind of how it sums things up. It says, the concept of boundaries comes from the very nature of God. God defines himself as a distinct, separate being, and he's responsible for himself. He takes responsibility for his personality by telling us what he thinks, feels, plans, allows, will not allow, likes, and dislikes. So God gives extravagantly to all of us, of course, but he has a distinct person from which he does so. And he calls us to do the same thing. He calls us to set boundaries so that we have a defined, this is who I am. This is what I'll do. This is what I won't do. This is what I allow. This is what I won't allow. And from that person, that's where we are able to give the most freely. So, continuing on with just a few other scriptures. So James 5:12 says, let your no be no and your yes be yes. And I think sometimes in the church we can make the mistake of thinking like no is not a biblical word. Like if somebody has a need, I am supposed to say yes to it and pour out my life because that's what Jesus did. That's not quite the case. We are allowed to say no. And when we say no, it's important to let your no be no. It's important that we have action to really have a backbone to be able to back up our no. The one caveat, as I was thinking through this, especially last night, I thought, let's go ahead and make a quick, really important distinction. So when I talk about, our no being no and our yes being yes, I'm not talking about saying no to Jesus. I'm talking about saying no to other people. There's a real big distinction. I just want to make sure that we're super clear that this workshop is not at all about learning how to negotiate with God on what he asks of us. That's ridiculous. And so, when Jesus asks stuff of us, we have the option to say no, for sure. But we say no at our own peril, not because God is sadistic, but because, and because he's waiting to punish us when we say no. Not that at all. But we say no at our own peril because ultimately his will is what brings out the very, very best. So when we say no and we don't come into alignment with his will, we're missing out on a ton, and we're probably depriving other people from a ton of amazing stuff as well. So somebody that I remember back in college, I got to listen to a guy named Paul Hawkins. I don't know if anybody's familiar with him. At the time, he was on the leadership board of YWAM, of Youth with a Mission. And he spoke for these some spiritual development retreat thing that we had going on. He was just kind of telling stories of, he worked for YWAM. So lots of missions trip, lots of big, huge world stories. I remember one time he was telling a story about a time that God asked him to go to India. And he kind of had this cadence about him as he would tell stories. It was just funny. So he was telling the story and he said, and God said to me, Paul, will you go to India? And he said, and I said back to God, no, Lord, I will not go to India. And he stopped and he said, when God asks you to do something, you have two responses. You can say yes, Lord, or you can say no. But you can't say no, Lord, because the moment you say no, he's no longer your Lord. Boom, shaka. Hello. Thank you. That was just such a wow, that's powerful. In all of this, I'm not saying, we're going to learn how to say no to Jesus today. What we're really going to do is we're going to learn how to say no to people when it's necessary so that we can protect the priorities that God wants to establish in our lives so that we can make space for those things. Let's keep going. So let's kind of look at some examples from Jesus and kind of just see where he lived with boundaries. The Bible talks a lot about how Jesus would retire away from the crowds. So there were certainly times that Jesus would, he always had people around him, always had crowds, times that he would break away from that and go away to just be with his Father, because he knew everything that I do, not even just I have to do, I want to do everything I do from a place of connection and communion with the Father. And that's what he did. Every single thing he did, everything that he gave because he freely chose to give. I was just wrapping my brain around this, like Jesus never gave anything out of resentment. That's pretty amazing. I don't know about y'all, but I've definitely given a lot of time and energy out of resentment. Oh, I guess I should do this. I'm such a good Christian because I'm doing this right now. That's ridiculous. And that was never Jesus's heart. Jesus's heart, he gave extravagantly, but he gave extravagantly because he chose to, and because he was able to give out of fullness because he was connected with the Father, because he set those boundaries to go and have time away with the Father. And he said, I only do what I see the Father doing. And Jesus wouldn't have been able to continually have that vision of understanding what the Father was doing if he hadn't set that time aside to go be with God. One of my present day just heroes is Heidi Baker. So Heidi Baker and her husband Roland have been working in Mozambique, Africa for I don't know exactly when they started, but lots of years. And I just looked it up last night. Mozambique is the 7th poorest country in the world. So, you can imagine just huge diabolical need, I'm sure, that they're faced with every day. I'm sure they could never, if they took every moment and never slept, they could probably give and give and give and still feel like we're not able to give to all the needs that are here. Anyways, but God's used them in just really incredible ways. They have tons of stories about miracles, people being raised from the dead, people being healed, whole villages hearing the gospel and giving their lives to Jesus. I think they've been a part of planting like 7,000 churches in the bush. I think that was the last number that I saw. They've established orphanages throughout the country of Mozambique that on a daily basis take care of and feed thousands and thousands of orphans. They're these amazing people, It's kind of like, they're like what I envisioned Jesus would look like if he was, in the flesh walking around today. And I remember I read an interview with Heidi a few years ago. And I don't know if this was for a season or if this was something new that she was just establishing in her life. But she talked about that she gave God her mornings. Which I can imagine that would be incredibly hard to set that boundary to say, hey, all these needs that are coming at me like a fire hydrant today, I'm going to step away from those needs for a moment because I'm going to give God some hours this morning. And then I'll come back to these needs. That would be, I think a lot of us would probably feel like, well, that's really selfish to just take a few hours to have time with God and get away. No good Christian would do that. But she did. She said, I've been giving God my mornings, and what a joy it is to give out of fullness. Because when she's with God, then she can get filled up, and then she can show up for other people's needs in the most powerful way, rather than showing up out of a place of weakness. She also says, more is accomplished by spending time in God's presence than by doing anything else. And I just love that. So Jesus set that boundary to have time away with the Father so that he could see what he was doing and he could match him in that. For Jesus did tons of miracles while he was here. And when he was with a huge crowd and this guy named Jairus comes up to him and is like, Jesus, you have got to come to my house right now. My little daughter's on the brink of death, but if you come and you lay your hands on her, she'll be healed and she'll get better. I just really need this to happen. So Jesus said yes, that he would go with him, which is great. But when Jesus said yes, in essence, he was also, his yes to Jairus meant no to a good chunk of the crowd that he was with. Also, when he was on his way to Jairus' house, that's when the whole, the lady that had the issue of blood touched him. So, he still did some really amazing miracles. But, I'm sure had he not gone to Jairus', he probably would have stayed with that crowd, and maybe there would be other accounts and other stories of different miracles that would have happened. But those things didn't happen because Jesus had physical limitations. He couldn't be everywhere at once, and he understood the power of my yes is going to be my yes, and my no is going to be my no. I love this one. Okay, so Jesus and Peter. Peter was pretty audacious sometimes, and Jesus set a pretty strict, firm boundary with Peter. So, Jesus and Peter, the disciples, have been hanging out for a long time, and Jesus is talking about his looming death coming up. And Peter, my own paraphrase version of it, Peter says, wait, you can't die. We have this really great thing going on here. How dare you even think about leaving us? That's just not going to happen. And Jesus looks at him and says, get behind me, Satan. Now, I've been pretty mad at people in my life sometimes, but I've never called anybody Satan when I've been really mad at them. But it's kind of funny in my head to think about doing that. Like next time I'm mad at somebody, maybe I'll just call them Satan because it's funny. But that is a boundary. My goodness, get behind me, Satan. And basically what Jesus was communicating through that statement was, it was a really strong boundary, basically communicating that he was not going to allow his friend's desires to get in the way of him walking out what the Father had asked him to do. Because if he had allowed Peter to do that, Peter would have been acting out of the kingdom of darkness and out of Satan's agenda, and Jesus wasn't going to stand for that. So he just laid it down like it was. A couple other kind of scriptures that I love that address boundaries are 2 Corinthians 9:7. And it says, "You must each decide in your heart how much to give, and don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure. For God loves a person who gives cheerfully." Don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure. That's super freeing. That is God's word. It's in the Bible. And I think when we think about that, we tend to think about that in terms of just money. But money's not the only gift we give. Our energy and our time and our attention and our love. Those are all gifts that we give as well. And we get to decide, we get to make the choice, how much do I want to give? And God instructs us, do not give out of pressure. And that pressure can be external, maybe we feel like we have to give, otherwise people will be mad if we don't. Or it can be internal, we all have the shoulds in our minds. Oh, I should give, blah, blah, blah. So, but when we give out of, in response to pressure, that's a recipe for resentment. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So a couple other scriptures. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Guard your heart." That implies set a boundary around your heart. And then Hebrews 12:1-2. So the writer is saying, "Run with perseverance the race marked out for us." He's admonishing the people reading the book of Hebrews. Run with perseverance the race marked out for us. That phrase "marked out," that certainly implies a limit. We don't have this limitless race. We have a race that is marked out for us. That means we have things that God has set for us to do and things that he has not set for us to do. There are things he set for other people to do. And if we try to do all of these things that we're supposed to do, plus all those things that other people are supposed to do, we're really kind of making other people powerless because we're taking away their divine assignment. And that might be sin. So there we go. Thank you. That is how Boom Shaka is used appropriately. Let's talk about what's in your yard. Now, first of all, isn't that just I think that's such a cool fence. I would love to have a fence like that around my house someday. So anyways, an analogy that I use with kids in therapy, because kids certainly need to learn about boundaries, but it's kind of an abstract idea to teach them about. So when I have a kiddo in therapy that I feel like, we got to do a little bit of talking about boundaries, I have a specific activity that I do with them. And so we sit at my little table and we get out colored pencils and we pretend that they're fence posts. And I have them make, 3 or 4 different little fenced-in areas, 3 or 4 different yards. So they've got 3 or 4 different yards here on my table. And then we write their name on a sticky note. And so they, put their name on a sticky note and they put that sticky note in one of the yards. And maybe mom's name goes in another yard. And maybe their teacher's name or whoever, needs to goes in the other yard. So they've got a yard for them, a yard for mom, a yard for sister, a yard for teacher, whatever. And then I have these little miniature plastic animals. And so I say, okay, so, this is your yard. Go ahead and put 3 or 4 animals in here that you're going to be responsible for taking care of. And do the same thing for your mom's yard and your dad's yard and whoever. So they put their little animals, maybe they put a dolphin in their mom's yard because dolphins are her favorite animal or something. And then we talk about how, everything that's inside your yard, those animals, man, it's totally your job to take care of those things. If you have a dog in your yard, it's your job to make sure the dog has a place to sleep and has food and water. And if you put, if your mom's got a dolphin in her yard, then it's totally her job to make sure that she's got a pool big enough for that dolphin to swim around in. And so kind of once they get that idea of okay, so things that are inside this yard are mine to take care of, then we use that analogy to talk about real life. So in real life, there are things like this too that are your job, your responsibility to take care of. It's very helpful when kids kind of have those boundary misperceptions, or if something really yucky has happened in their family, If kids have been removed by DHS, those kinds of things, it's really easy for them to take on that guilt. Like, maybe if I had been better, I must have done something that, made it so that I can't live with mom and dad anymore. And this is just something I do to help them understand, like, nope, that's not in your yard. That's in mom's, the choices that your parents made, those are in their yard. So I just explain that because I love that analogy. I think it just really simplifies boundaries for us, because even sometimes as adults, I think it can still just feel really abstract. So what's in your yard? We're going to camp out on this for a little bit because I think this is super important, because if we can define what is inside of our yard, man, that just makes it so much more clear what's not inside of our yard, what's not our responsibility to take care of. So the first one is feelings. Our feelings are inside of our yard. And I think, as a therapist, I feel like I'm supposed to really love feelings. And the reality is I just don't. Sometimes I just think feelings are super irritating because they're difficult. Who wants to own when you're hurt by somebody? It's no fun to own that, and much less to communicate that hurt in a powerful way. That's not fun at all. So I don't enjoy feelings all the time. I also don't enjoy necessarily how we use feelings in our culture. I think we can tend to go from one extreme to the other when it comes to feelings and how we own them. We can either ignore them, which I totally understand that. It feels really easy to do that a lot. So we can either totally ignore them, and again, that's pretty detrimental. Or we can swing to the opposite end of the spectrum and put them in charge. And that's just also super ridiculous. Things go really wonky when we make decisions and we behave with our feelings in charge. So our feelings are supposed to be kind of somewhere in the middle, really. The biggest thing that our feelings are supposed to be is they're supposed to be an internal signal system. So we're certainly supposed to pay attention to them, but they're supposed to be an internal signal system that gives us some insight generally into the health of our relationships. So if you and I are really dear friends and every time I'm around you, I just feel pretty good and peaceful and at rest and calm, there's a good chance that means that's a reflection of our relationship. That means that things are going pretty well, my best friend is here today and she was just yeah. Anyways, but if on the other hand, we're friends, and every time I'm around you, I just feel kind of irritated and frustrated and angry. That is probably a signal that something is wonky somewhere you're giving me, but I don't feel frustrated. Here's the thing, Josh. If you feel frustrated and irritated around me, your frustration and anger is yours. It's not mine, because it's your feeling. Yeah, that was a perfect segue. Thank you. That was very, very helpful. Because here's the thing. If I'm around you and I just feel frustrated every time I'm around you, that frustration is mine. That means that's a signal that, something in this relationship needs attention, and it needs attention from me. It does not need attention from you. It's sinful for me to just take these little passive-aggressive jabs trying to get you to pay attention to things that are mine to pay attention to. That's ridiculous. So when we have anger, it's not anybody else's problem to fix but our own. And I'm not saying we fix it on our own, but we learn to be powerful, assertive communicators that, with kindness and respect can go to people and say, hey, this is what's going on. I'm just noticing this is how I'm feeling. And I'm wondering, you can go on with the example, but I'm not saying we have to fix it all on our own. Often that happens within the context of relationship, and that's why feelings are really scary, because expressing our feelings makes us vulnerable. And that's really hard, I think, for most of us. But that vulnerability is just a huge, huge thing that leads to intimacy and leads to deeper and closer relationships. So owning our feelings, and not just our feelings, but owning the responsibility to communicate about them, is just crazy important. And one example I thought of that is the antithesis of owning our feelings in a powerful way and communicating about them in a powerful way is cryptic Facebook messages, or cryptic Facebook statuses. And you probably are thinking hey, I just read one of those this morning. Or maybe you're thinking, oh, hey, I just wrote one of those this morning. And there are things like when you see someone writes, I'm just so done. Okay, what are you done with? I don't understand. Or I wish I had friends who actually wanted to hang out with me. Oh, woe is you. Okay. And the thing is, I guess, hear me, I don't want to sound like a jerk. The thing is, the sentiment behind some of those statements is probably completely valid, when there's a grievance, when there's an offense in a relationship, like that brings hurt, and that's okay, but we have to own that hurt and then communicate about it in a powerful, respectful, but assertive way with the person that the hurt is against. It does no good to just spew out this blanket statement to the world, just designed to induce guilt from people. That's just a way to control and manipulate. It's a super powerless way to communicate. And so, thank you. So that's what I think about feelings, but I think it's also what Jesus thinks about feelings. Next, our attitudes and our beliefs. Oh, we are doing pretty good. Okay, our attitudes and our beliefs. We're responsible for those things. So if I show up somewhere and I have a crummy attitude, man, that's just nobody else's responsibility to fix or to tend to or to pay attention to but mine. If I'm in a funk, it's my responsibility to figure out okay, what do I need to do to more or less defunk myself, because this attitude, this is mine. And our beliefs, anything that we accept as true, we're responsible for bringing those into alignment with God's truth. And there is, in just a moment, we'll go ahead and show a quick video clip. So Jonathan David and Melissa Helser I don't know if anybody's familiar with them. They are worship leaders. I really like Bethel. So Bethel Church out in Redding, California. They are worship leaders out there. And I think almost about 2 years ago now, they were, or maybe it was just a year ago. It does not matter. They came to the One Thing conference down at IHOP in Kansas City, and they did a set. And in the set, Melissa Helser shares just this little testimony about a song that she wrote called Catch the Wind. And in it, she shares how she wrote the song, kind of what her experience was. And in it, she talks about just the importance of what we believe about ourselves and standing firm in those things. Confident sons and daughters. That is who we were created to be. That is the opposite of victims. We were not created, and we are not victims. We were created, and we can be confident sons and daughters. And so we're responsible for bringing our beliefs into alignment with what Jesus says about who we are. Because when we do that, that is just powerful. Not only for helping us feel good and have good days, but it shifts things in the spirit. It's really powerful. We're responsible for our thoughts. The Bible says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to take captive every thought. So that implies, that we are responsible for what we allow to stay in our brains. Sometimes, I don't know about everybody else, things pop in my brain all the time. I was telling Josh and Anthony this morning as I was doing my notes and kind of talking through everything last night, I bet, 5 to 10 different movie quotes popped up as I was just doing my spiel. Things pop in my brain all the time. But once they're in my brain, I'm responsible with what I do with that. I'm responsible with, taking that captive, in essence, what I allow to stay in my brain, what I allow my focus to be on through my thoughts, what I allow myself to ruminate on. Those things fall within my boundaries, in my yard. And I'm totally responsible for communicating my thoughts. Nobody can read my mind, although it might be funny if you could. It's a funny place sometimes. So switching gears a little bit from kind of the abstract thought world, our behavior. We're certainly responsible for our choices and our behavior. And I realize that, nobody in this room is dumb. I'm sure everybody realizes, well, of course you're responsible for your behavior. But I think it's just important to kind of define it and tease it out just a little bit, to really just anchor, oh yeah, I am responsible for my behavior, and this is what that means. So the whole idea of sowing and reaping, Galatians 6 says, don't be misled. You cannot mock the justice of God. You will always harvest what you plant. Those who live only to satisfy their own sinful nature will harvest decay and death from that sinful nature. But those who live to please the Spirit will harvest everlasting life from the Spirit. So our behaviors, whether amazing behaviors that line up with the Spirit or behaviors that aren't so amazing that line up with our sinful, our selfish nature, those behaviors always bring about consequences. The reaping, the sowing, the planting, the harvesting, they're always connected. And letting people own and experience the consequences for their behaviors is something that helps ourselves, helps other people to be powerful, because if we can own the consequences for our behaviors, that means that we can learn from our behaviors, and we can use the consequences that just happened to change course and say, oh man, that really sucked. I don't want that to happen again. I better, change what I do on the front end kind of thing. Conversely, when we do the opposite and when we rescue people from natural consequences of their behaviors, we render them powerless, One example, and this example is not based on any real life person because I just have amazing friends. I don't have anyone that falls into this category. This is made up. But one just example that I felt like kind of just drives this home a little bit is, let's pretend that I had a friend who was just constantly offended at everything. Just offended all day long. So offended that I was really their only friend because I was the only person that didn't offend them. So maybe I'm their only friend because they haven't built up their skill set to develop healthy relationships. That's their choice. They've chosen to be offended. They've chosen to not, invest in other healthy relationships, whatever. So I'm their one friend. And let's pretend that they call me for everything. Every time they're lonely, every time they need to talk through anything, whatever. And if I'm always there feeling like, well, I'm their only friend, I really, I just got to be there for them, I'm rendering them powerless because I'm rescuing them from the consequences of their choices. And that's not okay. That's not how Jesus asks us to live. But I think sometimes we can get it confused and we can think, well, no, but they have a need. They're lonely. They're whatever. I'm supposed to, Jesus says, whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me. And yes, he does say that, but he doesn't say that exclusively. So that leads kind of into the next thing, our choices, very much connected to our behavior. We choose how we're going to behave. So how often do we hear phrases like, well, I had to, or she made me. I have a lot of kids that say, in therapy, if we're talking through conflict they had with other kids, so, well, she got me mad. She got me mad, so I punched her. Well, if she got you mad, then I guess it was probably justified. No, I don't say that because that's ridiculous. Because it doesn't matter how we feel, we're always in control of our choices. And this comes directly from God. God totally values free will. It's a big, huge deal to him. I've often thought, Jesus, if I were you and I was just creating, the world and people and setting up the laws for how things would go, I would not have given people free will because people can be really dumb and a lot of awful things have come out of free will. And you're really gutsy and you risk a lot. And every time I've had that conversation, I've just come back to the idea that, you know what? He knew it was worth it. All the risk of all the suffering that free will has brought about. First of all, he created provision for it. He sent Jesus so that all that yuck can be redeemed. But also he knew love can't be true, can't be real if it's not freely chosen. So this whole idea of really valuing choice, valuing free will comes directly from the Father. We're responsible for setting our own limits, limits on ourselves, and this can be so many different things. This can be, limits on how much money do we spend? How many episodes do I watch on Netflix when I binge a show on a Friday night? How much food do we eat? What do we allow our eyes to view? All of those things are limits that we're responsible for setting for ourselves, responsible for setting and adhering to. And also setting limits on other people, which is kind of a trick statement because we can't actually do that. I can't make anybody else do anything. But what I can do is I can set limits to say what I will allow and what I won't. And I can set limits to limit my exposure to people when they're not behaving in a way that I think is okay. So there we go. Next, we are going to cruise on to talents. This seems, as I was putting my notes together, this seems like kind of a small one, but the more I've just thought about this, the more I'm like, oh yeah, God's he's all about this. God's definitely given us, everyone has a really unique expression of him. And a lot of times that shows up in our talents, in things that maybe we're kind of naturally good at. But often those talents show up in seed form. They're little, and they're up to us to cultivate and to grow those things. And that's something that absolutely falls in our yard. And often things that can kind of get in the way of us cultivating those talents and really stepping into them is fear. Not confronting our fear denies the grace of God and insults both his giving of the gift and his grace to sustain us as we're learning. Even when there's fear, we still have a responsibility to push through that and to walk with God through that and to cultivate what he's put inside of us. Even just this morning, I was going over my notes and stuff and I was chatting with Jesus and I was like, oh, Jesus, I feel nervous. And I said, man, I just feel nervous. I was like, what's your perspective? I need to know, what are you saying right now? And I just kind of sat quietly for a moment. And I felt like Jesus said, Chelsea, I just love doing things with you. And this, like, speaking in front of people, it's not the most comfortable thing to me. It's kind of a newer thing that I'm definitely growing in. But he said, Chelsea, I love doing things with you. I love stepping in and growing your talents with you. Because just like I said earlier, I have a unique expression of God that nobody else has. And when I express those talents and grow in those things, I'm expressing a piece of God that nobody else quite gets to express. And real quick, 2 other examples of people that are very talented are my sisters. And of course, neither of them are here this morning, but maybe they'll listen to the audio recording and they'll see that I bragged on them. So my sisters are just both incredibly creative, talented people. And like a couple years ago, well, lots of years ago, my older sister Chantel learned to knit. And I don't know how many amazing, just beautifully knit Christmas gifts all of us have gotten over the years. And I'm not talking about like sweaters. It's like, oh, my sister knit me a sweater. Like really just beautiful scarves and slippers and things. If they were in a boutique store, they'd be like $50. And my younger sister Nina is just one of the most creative people I know. I remember there was one year that my niece Bella was having a princess-themed birthday party. So the night before the party, Nina just had 2 kids at that point. And she decided they should go as Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker. So, I don't even know that she went to the store. She just kind of took fabric and, whatever was around the house. And she made these really amazing little, Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker costumes. They both are super creative and they found expression. They've cultivated those things and they found expression for it. This is my family. A couple years ago, we all dressed up for Halloween as the Despicable Me characters. And that is just a, proof of my sister's creativity. We're all pretty creative, but a lot of that was driven, like that blue coat. I think my sister just made that. I don't think she actually bought that somewhere. Maybe she did, but for our purposes today, we'll say that she made it. I'm 99% for sure that she made it. They're just very, very creative people, and they give expression to that, and that's very much in their yard to do that. So the last couple things that we are responsible for is our desires and our needs. Getting our needs met. That is just not anybody else's responsibility but our own. So I know from my own life, just kind of as far as schedule and pace of life goes, I tend to notice that I get really crabby if I don't have at least a couple times a week at home. It could be 1 weeknight and a good chunk of a Saturday, or it could be 2 weeknights. But generally, to feel like I'm functioning well, I need at least 2 chunks of time at home. One usually to do bills and clean and all that life stuff, and then another one to just be at home and let my brain just turn off. And those are my needs, So if my schedule is chronically all clogged up, it's nobody else's responsibility to unclog my schedule than mine. On the other hand, I also know that I need a couple times a week with people, with my family and my close friends. And so if I look at my schedule for the week and see, oh my gosh, I have 6 nights at home this week. And, it would be ridiculous if I just sat and thought, oh, why is nobody calling me? Why do I have 6 nights at home? Why doesn't anybody want to hang out with me? That's such a victim mentality. That's not where I get to live. No, I can be powerful and I can say, oh, I have 6 free nights this week. Hey, who do I want to hang out with? Let me give someone a call. Let me give someone a text. Let's get some things on the schedule, because I know I have these beautiful people in my life that I want to spend time with. That's being powerful and taking care of our needs. Last one in this section is our time. So everyone has the same amount of it, clearly. I think the problem arises when we blame others for our lack of time, or when we blame others for our lack of setting limits with people on how much of our time we're willing to give them. And if you like any of this stuff, please just read the book Boundaries. It's just so good. And I had this big, long example I was going to read from it, but I don't think we have time. But yeah, we're not responsible for, people can make whatever requests they have for my time. I'm the one who's responsible for doling out how much of my time I'm going to give to people. And I'm the one who's responsible for letting my yes be yes and my no be no. And if people get frustrated because I've said no, well, okay, that's their frustration. Time is one of our greatest mechanisms that allows us to express our values. So, the whole 5 love languages thing, I'm certainly a quality time girl, because I know that, if people spend time with me, that means that they really value me, because words are pretty cheap. But if we look at where we all spend our time and trace that back, that really shows what we value. So how we allot our time, how we spend our time, that falls right in the middle of our yard as well. So real quick, we are going to cruise on to our next slide. What is not in our yard? And cows. I don't know if you can see it. There's a fence there for sure. But if cows are outside of your yard, let other people take care of them. In the therapy world, teachers or whoever, professors in grad school said, clients will come in with cows. They'll come in with the crisis of the week. And if we spend too much time dealing with cows, then we don't have time to really deal with the real work and therapy that we need to do. So other people's cows, other people's crises, those belong to them. Because ultimately, if every single person is responsible for our feelings, our choices, our attitudes, our time, all of that stuff, that means I'm responsible for those for me. You're responsible for those for you. So that means I'm not responsible for anybody else's feelings or choices or behaviors or, all the stuff that we just talked about. So the Bible says to love one another, but it doesn't say to be one another. And sometimes I think we can confuse the two. And we can think, well, if I love them, I'm supposed to just really help them. But I can love you, but I can't be you. I can't feel your feelings for you. I can't think your thoughts for you. I can't grow for you. Things go really wonky when I try to do that. So setting boundaries to say this is what's inside my yard, this is what's outside my yard. Boundaries always deal with ourselves. They're not like some newfangled way to manipulate and control other people at all. They're just ways to communicate, this is what I will do, and this is what I'll be responsible for, and this is what I won't. And living with boundaries allows us to show up in the most powerful way. And a recent example I saw of this, I don't know how many of you either went to or know about the event Awaken the Dawn that happened in Washington, D.C. earlier this month. For anybody that's not familiar with it, it was just this ginormous prayer event that happened on the National Mall. And it started at 5 o'clock on a Friday, and it went through till late Sunday night, and then even some people stuck around till Monday morning. And it was just this big thing. So 24 hours a day, straight through from Friday till Sunday. And there were 50 tents lined up on the mall, so each state had its own tent. And so there's prayer and worship sets going on 24 hours a day for this whole weekend. It was a really cool event to be a part of. So a few of us definitely here from Heartland went out to that. One guy that went in our group, his name is Ken Peterson. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with Ken, but he and his wife Diane live in Burlington. And they're just fabulous, fabulous people. They've done a lot of pastoring in the state of Iowa, and Ken's got a really amazing gift for intercession. And so Ken was with us, and he was a huge help, I think, in helping facilitate things during the day. So again, this was an all-night, 24-hour-a-day thing. Rick and I kind of took the overnight hours and did prayer and worship sets overnight. Ken did a lot of facilitating of stuff during the day, just kind of keeping things going, kind of being there if anything got off track to bring it back on track. And he really poured out his heart and invested all of what he came to bring when he was there. So anyways, I didn't see Ken a ton because we kind of had opposite schedules, but it came to Sunday night, we're, getting ready to wrap up. And I was looking around and I didn't see Ken. I thought, where's Ken? It crossed my mind, and then I went to do other things. And we got back to the hotel later, and Ken's just been back at the hotel just watching football. And I thought, way to go, Ken! Like, how easy would it be to think, well, I'm at this big national prayer thing. I need to be there every waking moment that I possibly can be. And that just wasn't Ken's heart at all. And we talked about it a little bit later. He said, I really feel like we did what we came to accomplish. And I feel like, yeah, I gave the part that I was supposed to give, and I gave it fully. But I did that. And then I was, just really felt like, I think I need some time to rejuvenate. So I came back here and I watched football, and I thought, way to go. That's just such a good example of boundaries, and such a good example of having solid boundaries allows us to show up in the most powerful way. Because he had a set time that he was there. That freed him up to give all of who he was during that time. And he didn't have to worry about conserving his energy because he had to have energy for the next 15 hours. So when we do start to set boundaries, we will certainly encounter resistance. And this often comes in the form of other people's feelings. The first and foremost of which is probably likely anger. And the thing, like I said with Josh, your anger is yours. So if we set boundaries and other people are angry, the most important thing to realize is that anger is theirs. And if it's theirs, it says something likely about them. And what it might say about them is that they might be kind of self-centered. Maybe, not always, but maybe. They might maybe have the mentality that other people exist to fulfill their wants and their needs. Maybe they haven't learned to get their wants and their needs met in a powerful, respectful way. Maybe it's just the pattern of their life, the family they grew up in, their dynamics. Maybe they learned, like, you get your needs met through controlling other people. You get your needs met through being angry. And that's not okay. And so it's our job to set limits, kind of so that they can own their anger, and we don't have to bow to their needs. We don't have to bow to those angry messages, because their anger is theirs. It's not ours. The next one is hurt or guilty feelings. And for this one, I do have an example. It's a pretty quick one. All right, so quick little example. A man telephoned his mom, and she answered the phone very weakly with hardly any voice at all. Concerned, thinking she was sick, he said, "Mom, what's wrong?" "I guess my voice just doesn't work very well anymore," she replied. "No one ever calls me since you kids all left home." That's ridiculous. That's like not powerful at all. That is the epitome. Hold on one moment. That is the epitome of a guilt message. And I'm not saying, I want to also make sure I make a clear distinction. I'm not at all saying that, we shouldn't ever listen to feedback from people on our boundaries. Sometimes, people are going to have legitimate feedback. And so we should be able to hear feedback. And when it's legitimate and appropriate, we should take that, and certainly when there's healthy criticism or healthy rebuke, those things help us grow. But guilt messages, kind of like that, they're meant for manipulation. And probably not consciously. That mom probably isn't consciously thinking, I'm going to control my son. But that's what she's doing, and it's not powerful. And guilt messages are often anger or hurt or sadness or other feelings in disguise. The messengers of guilt messages, they're not recognizing their own feelings. Rather, they're putting the focus back on other people and other people's actions rather than taking responsibility and being powerful. And here's kind of the catch. So if guilt messages work on me to get me to change my actions and to get me to do something or to get me to overstep my boundaries, that means that there's a problem in me, not necessarily in the other person. That's just pretty huge. So blaming other people for making me feel guilty, that's just never going to lead to freedom. So the way to handle guilt messages, or really just to handle any resistance from other people, is you can certainly empathize. It's okay to say, "Oh, wow, it sounds like you're kind of frustrated that I won't do that right now," or, "Oh, I'm sorry that makes you unhappy." But implicit in that is you're handing the feeling back to them. Your frustration is yours. Your frustration, your anger, it's not mine. And then just restating, yep, this is what I will do. This is what I will not do. This is what I'll allow. This is what I will not allow. So Love and Logic parenting. I'm not sure if anybody's familiar with Love and Logic. It's this parenting curriculum that is just beautiful. And the guys that came up with it are all about these statements of explaining, having statements that set limits by stating what you will do or what you will not do. So some of their examples that I just kind of love is in regards to kids and parenting. "I give dessert to kids who finish their dinner. I'll be happy to do the extra things I do for you when I feel treated with respect. Or I'll read to you as long as none of your fingers are in your nose." Just those kinds of things. Other statements that, not necessarily with kids, but just general statements that communicate limits by saying what you will do or will not do is, if someone's yelling, you can continue to yell if you choose, but I will choose to leave the room when you act that way. Because we can't control what anybody else does, right? We can only control if we leave the room. A less kind of intense example, let's say that you're at work in your cubicle. Maybe you have a half an hour and you've got a big meeting you have to go to, and you're getting this report together and you just have a few minutes to do it, and someone stops by with an urgent thing they just have to talk to you about, saying something to the effect of, "Hey, thanks so much for stopping by. I can't talk right now, but I can catch up with you in an hour when my meeting's done." That's a powerful limit-setting statement. So that's kind of dealing with the external resistance to boundaries. We also have internal resistance, right? Because I think most of us probably sometimes have a hard time saying no. And when we realize we have that, it's up to us to take stock and to look at that and figure out, why do I have this issue? Why can't I say no to this? When someone gets angry, why do I bow to their wishes? And why do I go along with what they say. Do I have a need to perform? Do I have a need to make people feel happy? Is the only way that I feel loved and significant if I'm making other people feel happy? Or if someone's angry, does it feel like their love goes away? Just exploring all those things, I feel like that's the deep therapeutic stuff. But exploring all those things is really powerful because it helps us overcome our internal existence. Our internal resistance, and helps us ultimately make choices that lead to us being free. On this end of the spectrum, we don't want to just have no boundaries and, just be constantly exhausted and resentful. But on the other end of the spectrum, we don't want to be selfish in the name of boundaries. Some might say that you shouldn't do anything you're not passionate about. And, that's a good goal to shoot for. But someone's got to clean the church. I don't know about you, but I wouldn't be passionate about cleaning the church. And there's probably 100 other little things like that when you're in community with people just need to be done. Someone's just got to do them. And those things are never going to get done if we're all just selfishly saying, well, that's not my deal. I'm not passionate about it, so I'm not doing it. In this regard, it's really important to get with Jesus and to say, okay, there's these needs. Which of these needs do you want me to fill? The problem comes in when there's a handful of people that are filling all of these, needs that the clean the church needs. Those are definitely meant to be distributed amongst lots of people. One example that my mom, that I just love that is a good example of this is, so at the church that my parents and I and family all went to before any of us came over here. I was probably a senior in high school, something like that. And, it was kind of set up similar. We'd have worship, and then there'd be a transition time. Kids would go up to their class or whatever. And it was a pretty small church, too. So that particular Sunday, pastor got up to do the transition time, and he said, okay, now kids, you can go out that door with Carrie Arrowwood. She's going to take you upstairs and do a lesson with you. To which I thought, what? Are you kidding me? Let me do a little bit of background on my mom. My mom liked me when I was a kid because I was hers. She likes the kids in our family, for sure, like my nieces and nephews. She really cares about other people's kids, but there's a pretty big difference between cares about and wants to spend time with. My mom is she's not a kid person, and she is super duper aware of that. Other people's kids, she's not always a fan of. She cares about them, she wants good things for them, but working in the kids department, that's just not going to be her deal. However, that morning, there was a significant need, and whoever was supposed to be there wasn't, and there wasn't another backup or whatever. So she said, oh yeah, I can step in, I can fill that need. And that was good. That was her not being selfish. And then I heard that she was going upstairs with the kids, to which I thought, oh, I can step in and I can help fill that need too, because she's going to need some help real fast. And also with this, so in this, we don't want to use our boundaries to be selfish. We don't want to use our boundaries to be jerks. I've talked a lot about how other people's reaction to my boundaries, that's their stuff, and it is. However, it's not okay for me to communicate with anything less than kindness and respect when I communicate my boundaries. It's not okay for me just to be a jerk, and if somebody gets mad at that, for me just to say, well, that's their reaction. That's not Jesus at all. That is for sure sinning. So we don't want to communicate our boundaries in a jerkish way, and we don't want to be selfish. Chronically being offended. I think, man, in our culture right now, it's trendy to be offended, especially on Facebook. It's ridiculous, I think. Thank you. Boom, SHAKA. So if you find yourself living chronically offended at things, chronically upset by other people, chronically offended, there is probably something wrong with how you view the world and how you interact with the world. And even, if you're listening to the audio recording of this and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I can't imagine that lady just said that. That is such an audacious, I'm so offended that she would say that to me. Then you should keep listening, because this is absolutely for you. And I want to make a distinction too as I kind of wrap this piece up. When I talk about being offended, I'm not talking about righteous anger. There are definitely horrendous things that happen in our worlds and in our communities, and anger is a 100% appropriate and right response. But that kind of anger generally leads to action with logical thought behind it. Offense just generally leads to people, it's trendy to get offended, just to get upset by little things, big things, doesn't matter. It's just if people are chronically offended, stuff just gets under their skin. They're chronically offended. That leads to a bitter root, and that leads to, it's almost like they put on these sunglasses where they just have this lens that everything is colored now by constantly being focused on the shortfalls of other people. And, well, they're not doing this right, and blah, 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 blah. And when we think about when that's our focus and we think about how other people need to take better care of things, other people aren't taking responsibility for things, we're not taking responsibility for our feelings or our actions at that point. Offense. Heartland is a pretty big church, and let's pretend that I was new here. Maybe I've been coming here for a month. So I, sit in the middle of the sanctuary on Sundays. I see Pastor Dave preach for an hour, and it's a big church, so that's kind of all I see of him. Maybe the church I went to before was really small. Maybe at that small church, the pastor was really personable, and it was small, so he was able to stand at the back door and shake everyone's hand as they left, and that's a really lovely thing. So I could be sitting here at Heartland at my new church with my new pastor thinking, oh man, Pastor Dave, he doesn't do that. He doesn't stand at the back of that sanctuary and shake everyone's hands. He really needs to do that. That would just be so hospitable. That would make people feel so welcome. Oh, that is just ridiculous. And I could just sit and ruminate on the fact that I'm perceiving that he's not doing something right. When that's just the most powerless way to think. The way more powerful thing to do would be to say, okay, I can see this is a really big value to me. What's something that I can do to help make that better? We want people to feel hospitable here. I wonder if I could maybe get to know some people. And I wonder if I could talk to the leadership team about getting a team together to shake people's hands on the way out, just look them in the eye and say, thank you so much for coming today. That's an incredibly powerful thing. With pastors, I feel kind of just this protective piece sometimes, because what we see on Sunday mornings is such a little tiny fraction of what they do. Especially we've got amazing pastors here, and they pour out their time and their energy and their hearts in a million different ways every week that are often in secret, that we'll never see. And so who are we to see 1 hour that they do on Sundays and judge how we think they need to be expending their time and their energy? This is a quote from Danny Silk. This might be news to you, but not everyone should have the same access to you. And that is just so true, so true. Not everyone should have the same access to us. And you kind of look behind the quote. I thought the quote was good, but I like the graphic behind it because it's these little concentric circles that kind of map out, our levels of intimacy, and the closer people are to us, the greater access that they should have to us. But the further people are out, the lower the amount of access they should have to us. So Jesus certainly modeled this for us. His first priority was being in communion with the Father. He said, I must be about my Father's business. I only do what I see the Father doing. So it was he and the Father. The Father had, his closest spot of intimacy with Jesus. And then after that, the Big 12, the disciples, he poured a ton more into the disciples than he did in all the crowds that followed him around. And even within the 12, Peter, James, and John, it's recorded that they got to experience stuff with Jesus that some of the other disciples didn't. And then John is called the beloved, so even within the disciples, there's varying levels, degrees of closeness, and those different degrees dictate how much access they had to Jesus. And it can be the same with us. So Jesus, first of all, God created us with kind of that center spot. Danny refers to that as the God spot. He created us with the God spot because he has given us access to the deepest spot in his heart. So that God spot, number one, our primary allegiance is to Jesus, and nobody else should have the place of influence in our lives that he does. Let's go back to the other slide just to kind of have that graphic again. So the God spot, then me speaking of the Godfather, and I've never even seen the Godfather, but I just feel like there's probably quotes from You've Got Mail with the Godfather popping in my head. Anyways, so we've got the God spot. Then, the next concentric circle out of that, for those who are married, that would be your spouse. For those who are single or not married, that might be a best friend, that might be a parent, might be a sibling, but generally there's going to be just very few people in that next little concentric circle. Then the next one out might be your kids for sure, followed by maybe your extended family or your close friends, followed by maybe your work people, the people that you work with, followed by, your acquaintances, maybe the people that you go to church with, and it just kind of keeps getting bigger and bigger. And the further out people are, the more limited generally that their access us should be to us. Danny said this in his book: as soon as I treat people on the outside circles like they're my kids, I'm threatening my relationship with my kids, because they're the ones who rightfully belong on that level, on that kind of closer inside circle. I just love that. And he gives an example in his book that's pretty, that's not too terribly long, but just kind of illustrates what he's talking about. So his example is if somebody had car trouble. So the level of intimacy people have in my life determines how much of myself I will offer them when they pull on the relationship. If I'm chatting with someone from church for the first time and he tells me that the engine in his car blew up, I'm probably going to give my sympathies and offer to pray with him for provision. If I've interacted with the person a few times and know him a little, I will probably say, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Here's the number to my mechanic." If one of my good friends comes to me with the woes of an exploding engine, I may toss him my keys and say, "Here, borrow my car until you get your car fixed. Take your time." If my daughter, one of my sons, comes to me and says, "Dad, my engine just blew up," I will pull out my checkbook to cover the repairs. And finally, if Sherry, who's his wife, comes to me, there is no doubt in my mind that I am talking with the person who will be picking out the color of our next car. Because she is my most intimate human relationship, I'm willing to put all my time, money, energy, and resources toward helping her with her problem. After Jesus, she's my greatest priority and has greatest access to my life. And so that just helps to create a guideline for us of where do we set those boundaries? Where do we say no to people? And just giving ourselves permission. It's okay to limit access to people that are farther out. That's just how things work. Very important video. So this is actually from a car commercial a few years ago, but it just has a really great, deep theological analogy. So how much would we all like to have a personal trunk monkey? Somebody just, Somebody just to come in and solve all our problems for us. Wouldn't that be nice sometimes? Wouldn't that be nice sometimes just to have a personal trunk monkey? And also, how many times do we want to step in and be other people's personal trunk monkeys? Just come in and solve their problems. But that is just not so great. People who take responsibility for other people's lives and try to become their personal trunk monkeys are not loving. They are selfishly consuming another person's life and preventing him or her from becoming a powerful, responsible, whole person in the relationship. Boom, shaka, Danny Silk. Thank you. It's just so good. Because when we try to be people's personal trunk monkeys, especially all the time, we're in essence saying, I will work harder on your life and your problems than you do. And that is not love. That's a recipe for codependency. So if you don't hear anything else from this whole message this morning, this is what you should hear. Don't be a trunk monkey. I just love that, and I thought that was really funny. So how do we do that? We're going to get into that here in just a few minutes with kind of some practical time. First of all, we want to figure out what are our priorities. What is it that we want to say yes to? Because again, if we can define that, if we can define what we want to say yes to, that makes it a lot more clear what kinds of things are good, but what kinds of things we need to say no to. There is one more example that I want to read to you. It's a tiny bit longer, but it's totally worth it. From Danny Silk, where he just really kind of has this example that showcases a lot of these principles. Okay, so he says, for example, a while back, I got a call from a guy at church. "Pastor, it's George. My wife left me last night. She told me in a note on the fridge. I think she's serious this time. I need to see you right away." Clearly, George was coming to me with a need he thought I could meet, a need he felt was very urgent. However, the needs of other people did not control my choices. My priorities do. As it happens, one of my priorities is helping people who are going through relational crises, so I knew I wanted to help George with his need. But I also had to balance that priority with my other priorities. I had already told my son that I would play basketball with him that evening that George called me. The next day was our family day. Family always takes precedence over ministry in my life. So I made a choice. I would wait till I could look at my calendar in 2 days, see what I had open for George, and call him back. 2 days later, calendar ready, I made the call. "Hey there, George. I'm calling you back. How are you doing?" "Good Lord," came the distressed voice on the other end. "Were you sick or in the hospital? It took you 2 days to call me back." "No, George. Actually, I was playing basketball with my son. The game went long, and then I needed to spend time with my family. What can I do for you?" "I don't know, but I need to get in to see you. I have to see you. Can I come in right now?" "Well, you can come in anytime you want, but I'll be glad to meet with you on the 19th of this month." "The 19th? That's like 2 weeks away." "I know, but you're a pastor. I have to see you right away. I just need 5 minutes." "I have an hour on the 19th. That is what I can do for you." "But the note said that she won't come back until I see you." Probably so, but I will let you finish this conversation with my assistant, who can set up that meeting for you on the 19th. Goodbye. I never told George what he could or could not do. I told him what I would do without making excuses, apologies, or any attempts to convince him that my choice was right. I didn't need him to like the choice or agree with it. I didn't care if he was offended by it. I simply laid my offer on the table and left him to consider it. This is what it looks like to let powerful choices communicate boundaries to people. So we need to know, what do we want to give our yes to? What do we want to give our no to? And then we need to be ready to have words and, more importantly, actions to back up both our yes and our no. Because words without actions are really powerless and really cheap, and words without actions to back them up will basically teach people that my words are meaningless and you don't have to listen to them. What do I want my priorities to be? And what parts of my life maybe just might feel a little bit out of whack right now? Where do some of my own boundaries need to be reworked? And then there is, well, okay, I'll just explain. So the first page is a little self-assessment. Some of the questions I made up, some of them I adapted from, it's actually from a workshop I went to a couple years ago that is run by a guy named Scott Eblin, and he does a workshop for preventing burnout in mental health workers. So some of these questions are kind of adapted for our purposes from his little assessment. But just general questions designed to just kind of get us thinking about, how healthy are these different areas of my life? After that, there's a quick, on the back of that, sorry. There is a page with important questions. So just questions to kind of guide us through thinking about, where do my boundaries maybe just need to be reworked? What do I want to say yes to? What do I want to say no to? What gets in the way of that? And what maybe action steps do I want to take even this week to set some of those things right? And then the very last page, ideas that other people have rocked. This page is just full of just different practical things that other people have done to set more effective boundaries for their own lives. And some of these things you look at and they won't apply to you at all, and that's okay. They're just kind of general guidelines, just meant to, if something applies to you, take it. If not, that's fine. Except the one thing on there is to truly have a Sabbath. Let one 24-hour time period each week be dedicated to rest and recharging. And I think, this is something that's really near and dear to God's heart, and something that I think we can often overlook. So that is one that I think is applicable to all of us, and one that I would definitely challenge you, if that's not something you currently do, to figure out how to incorporate that into your life, because that's an important limit that I think God really wants each of us to set.